Hello and welcome to the Everyday Adventure podcast. My name is Nikki Bass and I'm a business psychologist, army veteran and everyday adventurer. I will be sharing my conversations with some truly incredible guests who are weaving adventure into their daily lives. And I really hope that these conversations inspire you to undertake your own everyday adventures too. So today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Nic Wilson to the show. So Nic is a writer and editor and country diarist for The Guardian newspaper. And she works for BBC Gardener's World magazine, and she specialises in wildlife, wild plants, the environment and environmental issues. And her work has been published and appeared in numerous magazines and anthologies. And she has also recently published her personal narrative, Land Beneath the Waves, which interweaves her own story with that of the natural environment that she explores around her. When Nic's publicist reached out to me and said, would you be interested in interviewing Nic? And I do get quite a lot of pitches, but this one there was no way I could say no to. I think not only in terms of Nic's personal story, but the way in which she focuses on the landscape around her, it just absolutely speaks to everything that this podcast is about. So yeah, this is really exciting for me when you get pictures that you just go, yes, yeah, this is somebody who gets what we're trying to do here. So Nic, welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
So obviously, I'd love to focus on Land Beneath the Waves and sort of think about, I guess, in the first instance, what was it that motivated? Obviously, you're a writer by trade and by background, but it's very different to write your own story to writing for a magazine or being a journalist. And I suppose, what was the driver for you? Where did the motivation come from, and what were you, what was behind it, I guess?
Well, I think there were two motivations and they came at different stages. So I started writing the book probably about 6 years ago. And at that stage, I was doing what I'd always done, really, which was to write about landscape and wildlife. So it started as a collection of stories that I was coming across and that I wanted to share from, what would it have been, 16 years ago when my son was born, stopping work in Cambridge as a teacher and being a stay-at-home mum for a few years and sort of doing a lot of walking around the local area, really. I think when we moved to Hertfordshire, so I'm in Hitchin in North Herts, when we moved here 22 years ago from Durham, so I'd spent my childhood and my 20s in the north, Hertfordshire was very different from anything I'd experienced before and felt really alienating to me to start with. And I think I didn't see it as a place where there was really very much wildlife, which was totally down to my inability to see what was around me and nothing to do with the environment itself. And so for those first few years while we were both working, if we went bird watching, which we often did, we'd go up to Sandy in Bedfordshire or we'd go off to the Suffolk coast or something like that. So I don't think I was even really aware, for example, that there's a wildlife trust reserve that I write about in some depth in the book, just 10 minutes from my house. And it wasn't until the children, I had my children and started to walk a lot in the local area with them because I didn't have a car to start with. So, buggying them to nursery and that sort of thing. And also not being very well myself at that period, and so not really travelling very much outside Hitchin, that I started to notice what was around me and started to get really interested and excited by the history of not just the natural history of the area, but the social history and the history of the natural history of the local area. I started doing quite a lot of research. And so I had all these stories to tell. And when I tried to put them down into a book, a collection of stories, it didn't really work very well. They didn't really cohere. I had a feeling that they weren't going to be very interesting to anybody unless they were interested in wildlife and lived in Hitchin, and that wasn't really what I wanted. So that was when I started to think maybe I needed to bring my own experiences into the narrative and look at why I was in the situation I was in, and why these stories were talking to me at this particular time in my life. So the first motivation was about telling stories of landscape and wildlife, and then it became about trying to bring myself into the narrative and making sure that I wasn't sort of splitting myself off, I suppose, from nature, which is something as a nature writer I was very against, obviously wanting people to see themselves as part of these wider systems and part of the natural world. And yet in the book I was writing to start with, I was doing that very thing. So so then I started to write about myself, which was completely new to me. And yeah, to start with, that was really, really hard. And I needed a lot of help with that.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? That thing that you bring up about that splitting and how
Mm,
it can almost, whilst it can be, being in nature can brings us such presence of mind or such, can be so fantastic for our mental health in so many
mm,
ways, and that we get absorbed in the landscape and become part of that landscape as well. I think that part you
yeah.
make about also that it can become a defense from actually what is it that I'm really feeling, what is it I'm really experiencing. I mean, just going back to your bit about, Hertfordshire and the difference in the different landscapes as well. I mean, having grown up in Hertfordshire, when I was reading through your book, I was like, yeah, I totally get it. I used to go I remember I used to go on school ski trips, and I always remember that feeling when I came back from the mountains and I came back to
Mm,
Hertfordshire. It was just sort of flat, and I mean, it's a very beautiful place. Now I can totally appreciate it, but at the time I was just like, there's just nothing here. There's just nothing
mm,
to look
mm,
at. It's just like a few trees and some country lanes, and it was so. I think it really resonated with me, just that sense of going, when you're looking at the surface of something, that's
mm,
actually that disconnect from what you were used to, but also just that sense of actually when you're able to find it as a way of an exploration,
mm.
and moving beneath the surface of that, which I think resonates with your book in the end of moving beneath the surface of something too.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, you mentioned about the challenge of writing yourself into the narrative, I
Yeah.
guess. What were the biggest challenges in terms of writing this book as a whole? What did you, I guess, and not just, what were the sort of the challenges, but also what are you most proud of when you look back and see when you've sort of presented it into the world? What are the
Mm.
things you think actually that was so hard and I feel like I'm so proud I found a way through that?
Yeah, I think that those two questions are very much part and parcel of each other, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah.
When I started to write about myself, having wondered whether I could just write a little bit about the chronic illnesses that I have and why they're difficult, not just because of the symptoms, but because of the history I had growing up with a mum with chronic illness. It turned out you couldn't just write that as a superficial thing. And very quickly, I sort of ended up back in a childhood that I didn't really remember, with 7 years of my life, first 7 years of my life, having no memories pretty much at all. And so, yeah, it all unraveled really very quickly. And I started counselling. I had a year's counselling while I was writing because I was pretty certain that I wasn't going to be able to write it without that. And so that was really difficult. And I think addressing issues as I started to go through that things I'd been ashamed of and things that had made me feel very alone and like there was something wrong with me, which I think very much came from my childhood, putting those on paper and then showing them to people when I had my one or two first readers was really, really difficult and took me several months with one or two of the bits to even, show them to anyone else. Um, so that was really hard. But I think alongside that process, I decided that actually I didn't need to be ashamed of them and they weren't things that, I needed to keep hidden and that a lot of people don't talk about things to do with mental health and physical health, and that actually talking about it was something that might help other people. And that was something my mentor said to me right at the beginning that helped me all the way through. Was he thought that telling the story would help other people. When I didn't want to tell it, that was something that really spurred me on. And already within the first week and a half of publication, I've had people coming back to me saying how much it's helped and how they've identified with it. And I guess also people saying that it wasn't the sort of book they'd normally read, but they'd picked it up for whatever reason. And actually, it really spoke to them, including quite a few men who've come back to me on that. Because my structural editor is a lovely guy. And he said when he first got my book to do the structural edit, he was a bit uncertain whether he was the right person to read it because I don't think he had any children. He didn't have chronic illness, and he was a guy. And he said actually having read it through, and he did an amazing job with it. We worked on it really well together, I think. He was really pleased he'd read it and would be going and suggesting other, of his friends who are in a similar situation to him read it. So I think it does have quite a wide appeal because I think either we will experience some kind of chronic illness that impacts on our ability to, do what we want and go where we want to at some point in our lives, or we'll be friends with or supporting or caring for somebody else who's in that situation. And I hope it will do both things. I hope it will make people who perhaps have shared some of my experiences maybe feel a bit less alone, which is something I really struggled with, but maybe also give a bit of insight to people who are watching other people go through those experiences. And it can be hard, can't it, sometimes to imagine what it might be like. So hopefully that might just help, give a bit of enlightenment on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting, that point about, that it can be hard to know what somebody's going through. But also, I think to your point that in a way, the idea that you have to be able to hit a number of touch points in a way to be able to find this book useful and poignant and interesting in its own right. And I often wonder if there's something around particular with female narratives or female stories. It's like, well, unless you're a mother or unless you're suffering from something similar, and then you can relate to it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I am a mother, but interesting, the bits that I guess I found really fascinating was learning about your background, obviously, but also the appreciation of just how beautifully it is written, and how you interweave those narratives around the landscape, around the countryside, around your walks and your explorations and the local history with your own story, so that you're brought in and out of the story in so many different ways. And I found that really unusual. And I thought, and I think there's something about appreciating the craft of a beautifully written story, narrative, however you want to frame it, and that's so relevant for everybody as well. You've talked a little bit about, I guess, the benefit of sharing and helping other people as well. I mean, was there anything else as you were going through either the process of writing that, that I often think when we start on an adventure of any kind, whether it's a big physical adventure or a personal or creative adventure, we've got an idea of what we want, what we would like to get from it, or what we want to put out into the world. And often what we find on the other side is maybe something quite different to that, or there are things that happen that you're just like, in no way did I anticipate that was going to happen. And that is the thing that just feels so precious. And I was just wondering if you had any of those moments when, on either completing the book or while writing it.
Definitely during writing it, because I'd never written a book before and I was a bit kind of scared about how do you do it. But it turns out you just sit down and write lots of 3,000 word essays. But no, I think it was, although there are some quite grim bits in the book, and it was hard to write and it was a hard period in my life. There was also an enormous amount of creative fun in writing the book and freedom to try and to play. I mean, when I do writing workshops with people, one of the things I try and get them to do in the activities, in inverted commas, is we talk about them as playing with words, trying to get people to play about with language, to work out about how different structures might work, and I guess just develop as a writer. So, I felt it helped me develop massively as a writer. And when I was writing it, all the way through, really, I never expected it would get published. I mean, I wanted it to, and I was hoping that might be an end point, but these things are really hard to do. So you had no expectations. So the main thing I held on to was that I wanted to become a better writer through doing it. I wanted to learn, because, that's a really interesting thing to do. And so, yeah, doing things like writing the poetry in it. And there was a whole section that was written as a play. So it was when I took my husband when he was 21 to Stratford upon Avon to see The Tempest. And we got caught in the 1998 Good Friday floods down there. And basically the book came alive and we ended up in this massive storm, and he ended up in a service station up to his waist in water, and so that completely disappeared from the book, although I'm going to release it to my subscribers of my newsletter, I think, in a week or two. But it was fantastically fun to write. It meant there was drama as well as poetry and prose in the book, and once it came out, the text kind of closed around it. So it was right structurally that it wasn't there because it was just a bit bulky. But I learned so much from doing it. You know, it was so much fun. So yeah, playing about different genres and be able to say things about the arts and the sciences and how they connect, and margins, both in terms of landscape margins and in terms of textural, yes, margins in text and marginal notes and things like that. You know, I'm fascinated by all those connections. So being able to play about with those in a narrative, and I guess structurally as well, when you write an essay, 3,000 word essay, you are playing about with structure, but when you get then to put lots of those together within a book, you know, you've got the individual internal structures, but then you get to think about how it works as a big structure. So there's just so many things playing off each other. And I found that really, really interesting and exciting to play about with and fun.
Yeah, no, well, it sounds like it was. And I guess, you know, it's so interesting to hear that given your background as a writer, because I think there's probably also an assumption when you hear people are authors or writers or, you know, that's your job, that it's like, well, of course, so a book would just come really easily to you. That's just a normal thing to be doing. So I think there's something about going, oh, wow. So that's a challenge for you as well, because it's a different way of writing. And I loved your point as well about the connections, because I think that was something that really landed for me, particularly when you talked about that thing of having to choose whether you are creative and an artist or interested in literature or whatever, or a scientist, and therefore you must, you know, and I think there's still so much pressure out there to define yourself in those terms. It's certainly something that I've come across in my career, and someone who's not very mathematical, but has ended up somehow with a master's in science, which I love telling my kids, because I'm like, if you'd seen me in GCSE biology, you would not have put that down. But I think how it made me just sort of, I guess, reflect on how limiting it is when you're forced to choose, particularly at a young age.
There are so many connections between things, you know, and I feel incredibly lucky that these days I'm able to spend my time using words, which are endlessly fascinating, to talk about the natural world, which is also endlessly fascinating. So my two best things, you know, squashed together in a job, sometimes outside, sometimes inside. And, you know, I feel lucky to be able to do that.
No, absolutely. So, you know, having written this beautiful book and sort of, you know, I guess put so much of yourself in it. I guess thinking forward, what do you have a next step? Do you have this is what I'd love to do next, or is it this was a project that I needed to do and now I want to continue in another direction? I mean, what is it either fired up for you or, you know, sort of where are you curious to go next, really?
Well, I'm not convinced there's another memoir in me.
So I'll let you off on that one. Yeah.
This one didn't really start as a memoir. It just really organically, as I went through it, it had to be a memoir. It wouldn't have worked any other way. It wouldn't have been an authentic, you know, representation of what I ended up having to put on paper if I hadn't done it like that. I would love to write another book because I just enjoyed the process so much. But I don't think it would be probably quite as much about me. But I've got something in mind, and I'm working on a proposal, and it's very much going to be about the nearby nature and everyday adventures, and very much down that sort of way, because I think that's something, obviously people are writing about it, but I think there's still a predominant focus on, well, I think I say in the book, you know, wild people in wild places, and this sort of assumption that, you know, if you live in a house and you can't get out for whatever reason, or you're restricted, or, you know, you spend a lot of time in the local landscape and perhaps it's quite suburban or urban landscape, that you can't engage with nature, and you can't. In fact, my book originally was called, the earliest title was called Finding the Wild, which was about, you know, looking for those adventures all around you. So yes, I'd like to do something like that. But I think the next sort of 6 to 12 months will be going around and talking about this book, and I feel there's a lot I want to say about it, and I would like to, you know, become more confident at public speaking. I mean, obviously I taught for a lot of years, but actually standing up in front of big audiences. I went to Olympia on Saturday to talk at the Allergy and Free From show, and, you know, just sort of developing that sort of thing so that I can be a bit of a spokesperson for some of the things in my book as well. I'm looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, and like you say, it's such a different skill as well to teaching and to and to writing and everything, and learning how to once you've got this, I guess once you've got this story, how many different ways you can communicate that, and people can engage in different ways too.
Yeah.
I think again, it's sort of fascinating that the narrative around adventure and around the natural world continues to persist in that way of it's got to be undiscovered, and it's got to be extreme, and it's got to be somebody doing a first or whatever it is. And I think I find it really interesting because it's something that I wrestle with. I know, I went to Kendal Mountain Festival last year, and I was speaking, I was surrounded by all these brilliant, incredible people who've done amazing adventures. And I felt like such an imposter because they were like, so what's your next adventure? I'm like, probably managing to drive back from the Lake District, to be honest, in the ice. That was pretty hairy. But it also, I think, was a really important sort of reminder to me about how, whilst inspiring those narratives are, they're also quite reductive in terms of who, one of the drivers for this podcast is about that democratization of adventure, that actually it is accessible to anybody who's got a doorstep or a plant or a way of engaging with something that they don't, that's new and interesting or different, that they don't know. Going back to your point about what did you learn from this,
and yeah, I mean, I say that in here about narratives, how much I enjoy them and how much I got out of them, and nothing wrong with that at all. But if that's the only voice that's coming out, it isn't anymore. But it perhaps was more when I was starting to write this, 5 or 6 years ago. And different ways of seeing reality and seeing interest in reality. I think I compare it in my chapter, The BFG, which is about this journey of 1,172 paces that I was taking day in, day out to nursery and back. I compare it to Monet's paintings, Impressionist paintings, where he's painting the same scene of a river with trees, but he paints it at loads of different times, with different lights and stuff. And I felt I was doing that with this journey. I was kind of, I think I describe it as being like a spirograph with the hiccups. So it's like doing the same path, but every time it's slightly offset. You're feeling slightly different, or you're having to rush because you're late for getting the kids there, or whatever. It's raining and cold, and so everything looks a little bit different. And I think when you're talking about building up relationships with the natural world and with landscape, it's that repetition and it's that seeing it. And also things like just the anticipation of, are you going to see that bird that often is on that corner? And that's how relationships are built. And I think you get a different, not a better necessarily, but a different, experience and emotions out of that kind of relationship than you do, going somewhere you haven't been before. So I wanted to put that on the page as well. And look at all the stories that you can find in a very short journey and where your imagination can take you.
No, absolutely. And I think there was a quote that you taught. I think it was Edward Thomas. He said, "Much has been written of travel, far less of the road." And that really struck me. This idea that actually we tend to think about things in terms of our existence in relation to them, and not of them as existing when we're not there, and all that's happening around them. And yeah, that really stopped me in my tracks. I was like, I guess it reminds me of that saying when people say, if a tree falls in a wood and there's no one here to hear it, does it make a noise? And I think, but it was also that sort of sense of there's so much life teeming around, like literally outside of your front door. And I learned a lovely new word, snicket, which I hadn't heard before. So that's my new favourite word. But this idea that, meandering through those little back paths and those overgrown hedges and all of those things, one, there is adventure in there because you don't know where they're going to go, but also that there's adventure in doing the same path time and again, but in different times, and seeing the different life that's there, and that's happening regardless of you being part of it in a way. I think is really exciting. And I loved how you drew that in.
I think it struck me
Hmm.
particularly when I was looking at some white violets at the side of one of these paths, how people were walking past me and almost not noticing me, even though they were right next to me. And it's almost like they couldn't believe anybody could sort of stop. So it sort of was outside their, their credibility, horizon maybe. So I didn't exist. It was very bizarre, whereas you kind of expect people to come up and go, oh, what are you looking at? Because everyone's busy, focused on their day and all the rest of it. And yeah, I think if when we do get time to stop and look at what's around it, it hugely adds to your experience of things.
No, absolutely. And like you say, you don't even need that long. You need a minute of just dialing into what's around you rather than focusing on where you're heading. And I mean, I guess that brings me to my next question, really, which is a question I ask everybody. But I would love to know if somebody's listening to this and thinking, I would love. Either I'm feeling sort of disconnected from the world around me or from the natural world, or I'm struggling in some way to access it for whatever reason. What piece of advice would you give somebody who wants to reconnect in that way?
I think it depends. If you're in bed, for example, as I was for quite a lot of times during this book, I think birds are going past the whole time and singing. And I was talking to somebody earlier on today about the Merlin app, which is an app you can get on your phone which identifies which birds are singing. So that can be quite good. If you're in bed, but you've got the window open, you can hear birds singing and you're not sure what they are, and you can't see them perhaps from where you are. If you get the Merlin app on your phone, it would tell you what was singing. And then over time, you'd get a sense of whether that was a bird that was outside a lot. It might have been a bird that you'd seen. So I think that's a good way of kind of tuning in and also seeing what passes your window. And I love to watch clouds as well and, kind of make up shapes in the clouds and stories about them when I'm feeling like I can't get out of bed to have a lot of energy. And then I guess also if you can get out but not very far, then looking at what's around you, either in your garden or it's just in the pavement cracks, outside you'll have dandelions and things growing, and then there'll be insects on the dandelions and focusing in like that. And I spent quite a lot of time, this wouldn't work for everybody because not everybody would be interested, but reading about the local landscape and reading, old natural histories and researching it. And I think for me, when I found out about the fact we were right on the edge of the Chilterns, so we've got chalk on top of chalk, and I started to look at how that impacted on the kind of plants that there are around here, and obviously they then affect the kind of animals, and also looked at some of the fossil records that have been dug up, and started to think about that whole sense of land beneath the waves, the old shallow seas that were here in the Cretaceous period. Then that, because I spent a long time at home, that sort of helped connect me to the bedrock of a county and a place that I hadn't originally felt like I belonged to. And that's where Tiffany from Terry Pratchett's The We Free Men comes in that last third of the book, is because she's a witch who can do magic on chalk. And I sort of started to feel this real connection to the chalk landscape through its plants and its animals. So I guess if that works for you, finding out a bit about what's around you, the non-human, the more than human creatures, then, you can often see them or hear them when you can't get out. And that maybe helps.
That's such wonderful advice. I love that. And because as you sort of suggest, actually when you're just rushing through something and you don't necessarily know anything about it, or you're not connected in that way because you're not thinking about the landscape. And again, I really enjoyed that sort of focus that you took about the historical aspect of actually how the landscape's changed over time, how where things have come from, and that knowledge is so powerful because it allows you to go, I think there's something just exciting about that learning part of it as well that often connects us with wherever we go. If we go and look at an old castle, or when we go on holiday, we'll often do, I think it's that thing of, we'll often do that if we're going overseas or we're traveling somewhere, we're going on holiday and we're going to go visit a site. We'll go, let's read this book about Ephesus or whatever it is, and suddenly we know something about it. But we never do that on the world immediately in front of us.
And that connects you with both the wildlife and the people that have lived, in your area. So that bit where I talk about standing outside the primary school waiting for the children, and that happens to be the headland where people would have waited for hundreds of years and talked about things. And again, that sort of being part of a process in a landscape, I think helps bed you in and give you a deeper kind of connection to it. And for me, those two sort of stories became parallel, my own personal history and the history of the landscape. In both cases, I decided it was really important to find out more about the past, because if you don't know where you've come from, you don't really know how you've ended up in the present. And then for me, with my children, wanting to go on in the future and not pass on some of the intergenerational trauma to them. But for the landscape, if we don't know we've lost nightingales, if we don't know that where we live was famous for nightingales, so famous in the 1880s that the foremost writer, nature writer from America, came to your, road from where I first came to Hitchin and look for nightingales. If we've got rid of them as a breeding species in the county, but then forgotten they were ever here in the first place, how do we ever take stock of what we're losing and see, how disastrously we're going downhill? It's something we all need to take more note of, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a powerful point, isn't it? Because it's, in the end, what you're talking about is that disconnect again. How, if you're so disconnected from a sense of a place, but also then are not invested in a sense of, well, I don't know, or I don't care because, what's it got to do with me? And actually, when you find ways to reconnect and go, oh, hold on a second, this was very in a very short space of time, we've lost so much. Then it becomes more of a driver to actually protect what you've got, you would hope. But so much of what happens, I think, that goes again, that when we're thinking about, I guess, protecting the environment, or, whether it's preserving, whether it's trying to, move things back to a way that they were, or to think about what you can contribute. Because I think that's also, I was just thinking, that's something also people struggle with is, particularly with the climate crisis or with the loss of biodiversity, people can feel so helpless and so like despairing. And to your point, actually, there's, even in the knowing of what's gone before, there is so much power that gives you a sense of agency, that gives you a sense of actually, there is so much there to protect as well, I guess.
And I don't think you need to know, scientific names of anything, or even common names of anything. It's not about knowing necessarily in a scientific way, although if that appeals to you, and it does to me, then that's great. But it's about, just having a bit of connection. And I think it's keeping in mind as well, when we go out into the landscape and look at wildlife, and it really helps us, that I think the best way it can help us is by developing a relationship with it, not going out there to be cured or to be, helped and then turning away and coming back again, but it becoming a meaningful part of your life. And, all wildlife, but particularly birds, function in that way for me. And so if I'm feeling really down and I see a bird, something happens inside me and I just feel a little bit better. And that's, not necessarily because it looks pretty or it has a good song. It's because it's part of what makes my life fun. It's part of what makes my life good. And I think that relationship hopefully then makes us more aware of what we've got around us and more, wanting to do something about it, which might be like me, volunteering. I've volunteered for several years now with the Wildlife Trust, and I did quite a lot of stuff with the RSPB, but it doesn't have to be that. It might just be talking to your neighbour about something you've seen, and finding out that you've both got hedgehogs around, but one of you hasn't got any way for them to get into their garden. So, you talk about that, or, talking to your grandchildren about something, or, the way you vote, but, I think we can all do things to mean that, in 100, 200 years, the natural environment is still there for people to, have a relationship with and enjoy.
Absolutely. Nic, there is so much more I could ask you about and talk about. I want to keep this going for ages. Just conscious of time and that you've probably got a lot of other interviews and things lined up. If people are listening to this and they want to either go and grab a copy of your book, which obviously I highly recommend, or want to hear you speak or want to find out more about your other work, where can they go?
Well, I think my book's now on Audible and various other, you can get an Audible version. In fact, I read that, which I found a really interesting experience. And I think it was really important to me that I read it because it was a memoir, and it's very much about coming from the north and being in the south. So accents are important. And so, so that's out there. You can get the book itself from most online stores, and there are lots of indie bookshops around the country, which would be great if you've got a local bookshop. People have been sending me photos, even a photo of one copy in a library, which I absolutely loved the idea of. So if they haven't got it, you could ask them to stock it, but I think quite a lot have. And then if you wanted to have those 350 word country diaries in the morning, because I'm one of so many country diarists, then that's you can search for that online, or if you get the Guardian, you'd find it in there. But if you search for Guardian Country Diary, you'd find our writing there. And I'm also on Blue Sky at Nic Wilson, and I post out the Country Diary every morning there. So if you follow me, you'd get it posted. So
Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm in there.
Awesome. So I'll pop all of those links in the show notes so people can go and find you, as well as the Merlin app as well, so that people have got immediate access to that too.
Yeah.
And now I'm also going to go and listen to Audible, by the way, because I've just been like, I need to listen to it now, as well as having read it, because you're getting a totally different experience. That's my car journey sorted.
Excellent. Thank you.
Nic, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time today. And I wish you all the very best of luck with the book and getting it out there, and everyone go and read it. And yes, and with your next adventures as well in the future. Thanks so much again.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Take care. Bye. So an enormous thank you to Nic for coming on the show, and an apology, because when I spoke to Nic, I did say, I think this will be out towards the end of July. So obviously summer has completely, taken over. Yeah, the summer holidays were not as productive as I'd anticipated in terms of the podcast, which happens every year. So I don't really know why it surprises me. But anyway, sorry, Nic. I wanted to make sure that I had the attention to give to this summary and to the podcast when it went out to you all. So yes, now hopefully I'm a little bit more in that headspace. There were so many themes, as always, that I could pick up with our conversation. I really loved speaking to Nic. I found her perspective so refreshing and honest, and her willingness to share the challenges in her story as well as some of the highlights. What's interesting in terms of recording this summary a couple of months after we spoke is to think about and reflect on what has stayed with me. And I think in Nic's case, what has stayed with me is the detail and the way in which she places at the forefront of her story the local landscape in which she finds herself. And it often strikes me how little attention we pay to the world that is immediately around us. And that's for very good reason. Obviously, our brain develops shortcuts to help us navigate through our daily lives and pay attention to the things that we need to pay attention to. And if it's a landscape is familiar to us, if we use the same routes the whole time, if we're busy and preoccupied and trying to fit a million things into our days, then obviously we are going to shorthand to the things that enable us to do that most quickly. Our brains are very clever like that. And whilst I think it's important to acknowledge the reasons why we do it, I think it's also important to be conscious and aware that that is where our minds will naturally take us. And in doing so, we risk noticing that world that is in our immediate vicinity, those little shortcuts or paths that connect different places, even noticing, the changes in plants or flowers around us, thinking about how the different paths interconnect in our landscape, and really getting a sense of adventure from those immediate surroundings. And the reason I believe this is so important, I mean, obviously, when we went through COVID and lockdown, our immediate surroundings became all that we had access to. And I think that is why I feel so strongly about the fact that we can find adventure on our doorstep, because for many people, maybe that is what we do have access to. And if we talk about accessibility in the outdoors, we can't necessarily change our surroundings. We can't necessarily just go, okay, I'm going to go off and explore this new area today for a whole host of different reasons. But there are always ways to look differently at what is immediately in front of us. And just even to begin by asking that question of what haven't I noticed today? What is there in front of my nose that I can just get into a practice of seeing differently, or even being aware of? I'll force myself to do it, just even going out into our back garden and sort of look in detail at the flowers there. And it's hard to do because actually, one, we're primed to look for novelty of things that catch our attention, but also because when we are caught up in everything else that's going on, finding that time or making that time to pause is really hard. So in the spirit of Nic's wonderful book and in the spirit of everyday adventures, I guess this is my reminder to you to, step outside or just look even outside the window or touch something in your immediate vicinity and just feel the difference. It can be using our senses just to capture what's around us can really bring a change to our mindset and how we feel about our worlds too. So I'd love to know what you think. As always, please do reach out and get in touch. You can find me on LinkedIn, Nikki Bass. You can find us on Instagram, Everyday Adventure Pod or Resilience at Work. You can find me on my website, resiliencework.co.uk. And please do get in touch. Always love to hear your ideas and share your favourite episodes and let me know suggestions for future guests as well. Super excited as well to announce that we've just found out that the Everyday Adventure podcast is a finalist in the Independent Podcast Awards, which is so exciting and really actually unexpected. So thrilled. I'm celebrating that at the moment. We're in the travel and adventure section. You can go onto Apple Podcasts at the moment and there is a specific category for the Independent Podcast Award finalists, and you can find loads of amazing podcasts in there too to listen to if you want a bit of variety as well. So please do go and check that out. Anyway, enough from me. It's been lovely to chat with you as always, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon with some more amazing guests. Take care. Bye.